Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about The Racket, a Rogue Reporter versus the American Empire by Matt Kennard. Let's start with definitions. What is the racket and what's going on with Matt? Our world is ruled by a racket. This racket is an amalgamation of different players, including transnational corporations, banks, hedge and mutual funds, and insurance companies. In effect, the many different concentrations of private wealth we have in our society. We often don't know the names of the people who run these institutions, but they hold the real power in our world and are backed by the U.S. government and, as a last resort, the U.S. military. But the racket is nothing without the media. The UK and US are noble. Even if we sometimes make mistakes, we are allowed to criticize. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, we are the good guys. That is another facet of how the charade is maintained. The media system in the West doesn't work by active censorship. The beauty of the system is that you don't need to tell journalists what to write. They support the status quo as a reflex. People slowly temper their opinions, gradually shaving off their rougher edges, in order to become part of the institutionalized thinking. If you enter somewhere like the FT, the Financial Times, which is where Matt worked and produced a lot of the stuff that comes out in this book, everyone has a very rigid idea of how the global economy works, and if you don't share that idea, you'll be out. Progressive outlets are vital to maintaining the facade of a free and fair media. They give the impression of fighting against the racket, when in fact they support it in the fundamentals. I learned that, in fact, newspapers like the UK's Guardian, probably the most influential left-wing journal in the Western world, are among the most biased and self-righteous institutions around. They are full of private school-educated Oxbridge graduates who see themselves as crusading liberals fighting against corporate and state power. But if you step a bit to the left of them, you will know about it. They guard their left flank religiously, instructing the world that anyone operating there is beyond the pale. The same is true of the New York Times in the US. When I started looking into it, I saw that the Guardian is actually intimately involved with the racket, and relies on the racket to run its day-to-day reporting operations. If you click on the city section of its website, you will find the whole section is sponsored by the neoliberal Rockefeller Foundation. If you go to the Global Development section, you will see it's sponsored by the equally neoliberal Gates Foundation. And this goes on and on. Corporate power has its claws deep into the Guardian. Delve deeper into the website and you will find the Sustainable Business Zone, where its social impact section sponsor is the mining giant Anglo American, and its sustainable living section is sponsored by consumer goods giant Unilever. There, these companies are given free rein to publish corporate social responsibility nonsense, an effort to improve their image so they have less trouble exploiting the countries where they make their profits. The Guardian itself officially says that this sponsorship has no impact on how it reports news, but I had my own experience of this maybe not being wholly true when I reported from a town in El Salvador called Nejapa, where many residents could not afford clean drinking water for themselves and their families, despite the fact that they lived on top of a huge aquifer. When I was preparing the story with my colleague, the brewing company Sab Miller, when asked for a report, started getting heavy about what we might be putting in the article. They sent me a joint report on Nejapa they had authored with Oxfam, showing in the process how the racket now has its tentacles in NGOs as well. In the end, Sab Miller were only briefly mentioned in our article, and one of our spokesmen was quoted in the piece. But just a few days later, I noticed that The Guardian was carrying a news article, sponsored by the Gates Foundation, of course, on its website. It was a 900-word interview with Carl Lippert, president of the Latin American division of Sab Miller, which read like a corporate press release. He was given long spaces to expatiate on his company's commitment to water security without any pushback at all. Then he responded at length to the criticism in our article over corporate control of water in Nejapa. I thought this was a weird thing for The Guardian to run as a news story. Lippert is completely unknown, and in much of the article he spoke about the story we had done. The Guardian, I later learnt, had a partner zone, sponsored by Sab Miller on its website. So, I've been referring to the racket, but this isn't a term that Matt made up. He took it from General Smedley Butler, who was the most decorated U.S. Marine at the time of his death, And he referred to what he had been doing his whole life in the military. He woke up to it later in his life before he died. And he called what he had been doing for the US government a racket. Now, rather than keep trying to explain, I'm just going to read his words to you, which Matt quotes at the very beginning of the book. This was a speech given in 1933. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time, as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Now, keep in mind, Smedley Butler won the Medal of Honor. So anyone who hears this and you don't tell them who said it, they might say, oh, that's just some lib. It's like, no, it's a Medal of Award-winning U.S. Marine General. And that should usually shut them up, because they refuse to think through the implications of this. If a Medal of Award winner says that most of my time in the military was spent being, and I quote, a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers, and that I was a racketeer and a gangster for capitalism, it destroys the narrative of America being the greatest country ever, and we're the good guys, and all we ever do is help people, and we defend freedom or whatever else. This isn't something recent. You can't say, oh, well, this is Iraq or Afghanistan. So, no, he died. He gave the speech in 1933, and he was referring to what he did for 33 years prior to that. So that's 1900 to 1933, back when some of these so-called conservatives would talk about the golden age of America. So there's just an unwillingness or an inability of Americans to look honestly at our legacy, our historical legacy, both at home and abroad. Because if they were to look at it, they may ask some fundamental questions about what their beliefs are. And they would say, are my beliefs true, or are they just my feelings? And that's a good question to ask about anything in life, not just about what America is for Americans. So you have to realize there's some other cross-references in this book, and I think I might have it around. Well, I have it somewhere, but there's Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And the book is referenced specifically, but a lot of what he talks about is referenced to economic hitman policy. So the next few quotes I'm going to read, I just want you to file that in your mind under economic hitman policies. These are things that are part of how so many nations in the world are kept down, despite the fact that they are filled with people who want to work hard and save for their family just like many other people. They're not allowed to do that by other countries who profit off of keeping them down and destitute. So this is talking about Haiti. The commission would also decide how much the Haitian government would retain of each asset, with a cap at 49%, a minority stake stripping the Haitian people of control over their own industries. And this was in 1996. So it's a way to make sure that you can say you're helping the Haitians, but realistically, you're controlling it for your own profit, not really helping them. Here's something else. The internal Haitian market continues to be ignored by all parties, a travesty considering that 90% of eggs and poultry consumed in Haiti come from the Dominican Republic, while 80% of rice is imported. Changing that state of affairs through publicly funded subsistence farming is not an option. When I say agriculture, I say agribusiness, said Mr. Almeida. The alternative, which is unthinkable in the world of these institutions, is that money is provided to subsidize domestic small rice production. They're allowed to have their own chickens. They're allowed to have their own rice. And so instead of spending the country's money vis-a-vis these foreign shareholders to make themselves rich by importing from the DR next door, another country, you could allow the Haitians to have their own chickens, grow their own rice, not only for themselves, but to sell a little bit to others and maybe to other countries. But no, that would imply that people get to decide what happens in their own country. They can't be allowed to do that. That's a crazy idea. These programs, officially called structural adjustment programs, this is about the IMF, were precisely attuned to what growing transnational corporations wanted from these developing world countries. Under IMF control, they had to privatize. They had to cut back on public expenditure for things that would help ordinary citizens, such as public health and education, and they had to orientate their whole program not just to paying their debt, but they also had to welcome transnational corporations into the country on the nicest possible terms. And I'm sure it's because those transnational companies, they have the best interests of those countries at heart. That's why they're there. They're there to do good. Free trade agreements often only benefit labor, not wages, in the poorer country, while locking in an investor rights economic climate. And when I say benefit, I should add that the type of work it locks poor countries into is often sweatshop labor, as subsistence or small-scale agriculture is destroyed by subsidized products from the US or Europe coming in without tariffs. The people have to leave the countryside and become part of this new economic miracle of working in sweatshops for slave wages 6 days a week. And I just want to put a footnote here that sometimes this is unintentional. It's even done by do-gooders. I often share the story about Tom's, which was one of these companies that wanted to do good with every purchase. And so if you bought Tom's, they would then donate free shoes to somewhere in Africa. But what happened was they wiped out an entire group of entrepreneurs in Africa who went around collecting shoes and reselling them. And once you just dumped a bunch of free shoes on the market, you destroyed this entire infrastructure of people who made their money for their families selling shoes. And so even sometimes when you want to quote unquote do good, if you don't study the situation, you end up doing something worse than you had planned. In a 6-day period over Christmas 2010, while I was working for the FT in London, 2 prominent anti-mining activists in El Salvador were shot dead in broad daylight. First, Ramiro Rivera Gomez, vice president of the Cabañas Environment Committee, which was campaigning to stop Canadian mining company Pacific Rim from opening a gold mine in the area, was killed while walking with his 14-year-old daughter. 6 days later, Dora Alicia Recinos Sorto was shot returning from washing laundry in a nearby lake. She was 8 months pregnant and another prominent member of the CEC. Amnesty International called on the Salvadoran authorities to investigate the killings, but nothing happened. So, if you enact economic hitman policies and the locals try to oppose you, you get killed. And the people who are there don't want to chase you off, so nothing happens. As I say sometimes in these book reviews, I can't say if you like what you're hearing, hit like and subscribe. But let me say, if this is helpful to you or if you're interested, consider hitting like, subscribing to the channel, and getting more content like this in the future. So, how does the racket get institutionalized? I've made references to the IMF, but there are other institutions which are quote-unquote ostensibly the good guys, which actually are part of the problem. So let's talk about some of those. 2 men dominated the process of designing the new global order. This is after World War II. Harry Dexter White, a U.S. diplomat, was there to make sure everything was set down with U.S. interests in mind. He was up against a more honest and respected economist from Britain, John Maynard Keynes, whose ideas did not win out. The resulting arrangements prioritized American interests. White, after all, had considerable leverage thanks to the United States' economic supremacy at the time. He followed the course laid down by Franklin D. Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who said early in World War II, "Leadership toward a new system of international affairs in trade and other economic affairs will devolve very largely upon the United States because of our great economic strength. We should assume this leadership and the responsibility that goes with it, primarily for reasons of pure self-interest." You can't fault the man for being honest. Despite constant U.S. propaganda to the contrary, such self-interest, or naked imperialism, was the main motivation to sculpt a world in its image, to create a global population working for elite U.S. interests, while at the same time thinking they were working for their own. The fiction of free trade is one of the most potent weapons in the armor of the U.S. in prizing concessions out of weaker countries and consigning them to an eternity of underdevelopment. More accurately, free trade refers to the freedom of America to do as it pleases in its trading relationships, while everyone else is forced to create economies conducive to being flooded by American goods. So if you don't know about GATT, G-A-T-T, this was a system of treaties that paved the way for the WTO. One academic notes further how the U.S. actually formally remained outside the GATT regime. The U.S. Senate never ratified the GATT, but he adds the Senate allowed the GATT system to work in a legal sense by and large. This precarious relationship with the GATT was consciously created because it allowed the U.S. to be largely unconstrained by agreements which could have damaging economic consequences, while taking advantage of markets that could be prized open through this organization. Another of the major myths promoted by the U.S. and its agents is that trade liberalization, which is code for getting rid of obstructions to U.S. products, is a vital prerequisite for development. The truth is very different. The East Asian economies that have developed impressively in the second half of the 20th century are market economies. But South Korea, for example, is far from a free market economy. It is, in fact, highly controlled and has bucked the structural adjustment rules. Taiwan is the same. It refused to abandon the economic tools it had in place to protect indigenous industry. Economic success followed. The historian Ellen Maskins-Wood goes further, stating that the UN's very existence was geared toward discouraging forms of international organization less congenial to the dominant powers. The undemocratic nature of the Security Council would seem to support Wood's thesis, even though some historians argue that at the end of World War II, the necessity of a rapprochement between the great powers was greater than any idealistic commitment to democracy. Regardless of the historical contingencies and the original intent of the U.S. planners, the treatment of the UN over the next 50 years certainly indicates that the institutional framework laid down in 1945 was consciously left open to manipulation. From its inception, the UN has enabled the U.S. to enforce its own foreign policy objectives with a veneer of international support. Because of its legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, the UN is a part of the U.S. effort to legitimate foreign wars in the eyes of its citizens and its allies. I mean, where is the UN located? In New York. The method used for maintaining primacy over the United Nations has primarily been the use of foreign aid. Available statistics demonstrate the corollary between U.S. aid and votes at the United Nations. Basically, the U.S. grants aid money when certain countries guarantee to vote in line with the U.S. at the UN and other multilateral bodies. If votes can't be bought, the U.S. will veto. It has by far the highest veto record of any power on the Security Council in the period since the 1960s. It has consistently blocked resolutions calling on states to observe international law. Behind the U.S. is Britain, with France and Russia far behind. And I'll give you three guesses. No, I'll just give you one guess for what most of those vetoes have been about. What country has those vetoes in the UN been about? Just one country. One of the main institutions of enforcement through violence is NATO, which was signed into force in April 1949. It is a military pact among Western countries that is supposed to commit all countries to the defense of their allies should they be attacked. In practice, it became a vehicle for the United States to protect its interest in Western Europe. And keep in mind, too, this is so put in as a narrative that you have Piers Morgan embarrassing himself when talking with Tucker Carlson recently, when he says NATO has never attacked anybody. It's a purely defensive alliance, forgetting that what they did in Yugoslavia. And he says, and Morgan is someone, he's like, my brother was there, as if that gets him out of saying, how is that defensive? It wasn't defensive, it was offensive. So he made an assertion because he totally buys into the lies. He can't even think through the implications of being contradicted. It was fun to see that. It's always fun to see Piers Morgan get embarrassed. The problem for Sandberg and the Americans is that they work militarily in 130 countries around the world. No other country does that. Of course, the dynamic is the same. People don't like outsiders coming in and killing their people. But those outsiders are nearly always American. Ask an Iraqi, or Afghani, or Honduran, or Guatemalan. The flag representing the embassy at this point, and if you don't know, the term flag is just a spokesman. The flag representing the embassy at this point reminded me that the Americans were, quote, here at the request of the government, working in areas that the government has identified, unquote. This is the oldest American propaganda line there is. Like all the best propaganda, too, it has a semblance of truth if decontextualized. So, of course, the Honduran government has invited the U.S., but it's a government the U.S. installed and is backing to the hilt against their own people. So it would be a huge surprise if they rejected U.S. solicitations to base themselves in the country. This is the problem of the American empire. It has to hide itself continually. It has to live in the shadows, not allowing detection, because the country is founded on strong anti-imperialist ideas, and its media class would implode if it reported the truth. So now a little bit about USAID, which I have to say, prior to a few weeks ago, I never thought so many people would know that this horrible agency, this agency of evil, exists. And now, because of what Musk and Trump are doing, a lot of people are finding out about it, and it looks like it might get shut down. We'll see. I don't know. But it has been a slight bit of encouragement to me. And the book covers some ideas about USAID. Mark Fierstein, USAID Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean, put its raison d'etre bluntly in December 2010 when he said, USAID programs are not charity. They are not only from the American people, as the agency's motto says, they are for the American people. I.e., we better be getting something for our money. USAID Bolivia programs include support to promote decentralization, i.e. attacking the government, and municipal strengthening, support to Congress and political parties. There is no mention of which political parties it is supporting, but this is candid language that the group and the U.S. Embassy have never used in public. And here he puts in parentheses, Morales, this would have been President Evo Morales at this time, has said that one mayor told him that USAID offered him $15,000 to $25,000 to oppose the president. Decentralization in this context is also a euphemism for strengthening the opposition. One of USAID's central functions in Bolivia, ramped up since 2005, has been moving power away from the central government, an effort which clearly chimes with the interests of the opposition in the East. And here you have to know a little bit about Bolivia, which he gives you some sense of a group of oligarchs operating in the East who do not want a strong Bolivia, because that would mean their sweetheart deals with foreign nationals would get cut out. The Justice Project sought reforms in the commercial and administrative law areas, as well as business organization assistance and training. For this purpose, USAID funding would help develop a civil, commercial, and administrative law curriculum for law schools in Bolivia. In a sign of the penetration of USAID into the highest echelons of the justice system, USAID and the Bolivian Supreme Court jointly published a document called Civil and Commercial Justice in Bolivia, Diagnosis and Recommendations for Change, which urged the creation of a specialized commercial law jurisdiction. It would enhance the investment climate of Bolivia, while the establishment of a good business climate is essential to attracting investment, and will maintain and improve its competitiveness. It noted, this component was important to the overall success of the project due to the fact that it enlisted enthusiastic support from many private sector actors, while also furthering the goal of improving the investment and business climate in Bolivia. Now, pause for a moment. Is there anything wrong with an outside agency working with the Bolivian Supreme Court to talk about potential reforms in law? Not at all. But it would probably make sense for it to be a Bolivian agency. Because I want you to think about this. Let's frame it for the Americans. What if there was a Bolivian agency, Bolivian AID, who came and authored a paper with the U.S. Supreme Court talking about changes in law that could be made that would benefit trade with Bolivia? Because if you use that frame, then you realize how ridiculous this is. That you would have an outside organization labeled USAID operating in Bolivia, talking about how the law in Bolivia needs to be reformed. and how those laws in their reformation would benefit foreign nationals and not benefit, would harm the people of Bolivia, the citizens of Bolivia. It's nakedly unfair, but since it's hidden and most people don't know about it, they don't realize it. There are other agencies that are used, not just USAID. Many had long said that the DEA was acting as a front for the CIA in Bolivia. The agency refused my request for information through the Freedom of Information Act, as did the National Security Agency. As I've said before, and I'll say again, the truth doesn't need protection, but lies do. If you refuse a request for information, it means you've got something to hide. And if you're only doing good, why would you have anything to hide? Bolivia also announced more military purchases from China and Russia after the U.S. blocked Bolivian purchases of Czech aircraft. And think about that. The Czechs wanted to sell aircraft, and America said, no, you're not allowed to do that. So they're telling one country what it can do with another country, of which neither of them are America. Most worryingly for the U.S., Venezuela and Cuba were also increasing their presence, a fear constantly discussed in the cables. One cable from La Paz noted, Cuban and Venezuelan advice, interference, and assistance continue to be a serious concern. Again, imagine, what if you wrote, American advice, interference, and assistance continue to be a serious concern. Remember, it's only bad if it's someone other than America who's interfering in your country. The concern is listed as Cuban doctors and newly inaugurated hospitals bring medical care to isolated communities, while Venezuela provided microcredit financing to small business. How dangerous. Unlike USAID, of course. Venezuelan funding is pouring into the country with no transparency or accountability, further damaging the democratic process. This is a classic example of every accusation is a confession. In February 2008, a story broke out about a Fulbright scholar in Bolivia who had been asked to spy on Cubans and Venezuelans in the country. John Alexander von Schaik said that he was told by Regional Security Officer Vincent Cooper at the U.S. Embassy to provide the names, addresses, and activities of any Venezuelan or Cuban doctors or field workers he came across while he was in Bolivia. He's just a student, and he just thought he was going to be there to learn, probably speak Spanish, learn more about the country, and he's being told, oh, by the way, you're going to need to spy on the Venezuelans and the Cubans. His account was supported by similar testimony from Peace Corps members and staff who were all told by Mr. Cooper to gather information on Cuban and Venezuelan nationals. 3 days after the story broke, it was announced that Mr. Cooper would not be returning to Bolivia. Morales called it the expulsion of a man who conducted North American espionage, an accusation with some justice. Many believed it was the tip of the iceberg. We had a mutual friend, and von Schaik approached me in December 2007. John Friedman Rudofsky, the American journalist living in La Paz who broke the story, told me. It took a couple months to get a hold on the Peace Corps angle. I heard lots of rumors, but hadn't been able to substantiate them. The Peace Corps duty director went on record at the time saying Vincent Cooper came and gave these inappropriate instructions to the group. The volunteers were in a moral quandary about what to do. Some kids were worried about the message coming from the embassy. One girl was planning on living with a Cuban family. She wondered if she would have to collect information on them, said Friedman Rudofsky. The director and the Peace Corps staff complained to the U.S. Embassy, remonstrating that they couldn't act like an intelligence service for the U.S. government. 4 months later, however, Van Schaik received the same instructions. In general, not much has changed in terms of U.S. Bolivia since Obama came to power. And this is something that President Putin has said before. The presidents come and go in America, but they don't really make the decisions. It's the men in the dark blue suits who tell the presidents what they're allowed to do. And that's why you have this Obama administration come in and not a lot changes in foreign policy. The ambassador never admitted it had happened. He merely commented that if these instructions had been given, it went against U.S. policy. But the smoking gun is Mr. Cooper was not allowed to return to Bolivia 3 days after the story broke. So what do you think really happened? U.S. weapons and military had been found in Bolivia. In June 2007, Donna T. Din, a 20-year-old American woman, was detained at La Paz airport after arriving on a flight from Miami. The authorities found 500 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition in her luggage. Miss T had initially claimed to customs that she was carrying cheese. She was met at the airport by the wife of a military liaison at the U.S. Embassy in La Paz. U.S. Ambassador Philip Goldberg said that the bullets were for training and sport shooting, and she did not realize that she had to declare them, which is why she said they were G's. This might be true, but at the very least it shows the impunity with which Americans felt they could act in Bolivia. Could you imagine bringing 545 caliber rounds into any country that you're not a citizen of? And even if you were a citizen? Bolivia's director of migration, Magali Zagara, noted, "The fact that a North American citizen related to the embassy is carrying ammunition on a North American aircraft coming from Miami, a city where terrorists from all over Latin America are protected by the government, especially their teacher, as Posada is called by the terrorists, and make a mockery of all mechanisms, is questionable." In another incident, in March 2006, Tristan J. Amero, a 25-year-old from California, set off 300 kilos of dynamite at 2 hotels in La Paz. He was carrying 15 different identity documents. 2 years later, security services uncovered the presence of 2 fake American journalists photographing presidential vehicles. I mean, stories go on and on and on. So, some criticisms I have. So I have to say I came to the book with a lot of expectations, in part because of Matt's work on Palestine and even documented in a documentary I covered on Film Club on my Palestine Bookshelf channel. He was critical in uncovering the fact that the Royal Air Force Base in Cyprus was helping with surveillance overflights over Palestine during this recent bout of violence between October 2023 and 2025. And it led to protests there and a recognition that these days you can't hide everything from the people. So I thought I was going to see more of that, as well as other things I've seen Matt interviewed on. So I don't think I've ever come to a book having watched so many interviews of the reporter. I probably watched a dozen interviews featuring Matt Kennard before I picked up this book. So I think this book came out in 2014. So in a sense, Matt has really moved on. Yeah, 2015 was the first time, and this is a 2024 edition, so maybe it has a few updates. But I think this was something that Matt set up as an ideological frame for who he is. Now, he's a hardcore leftist, all right? And I was going to say there's nothing wrong with being a leftist. That's not true. But that's fine. He wears his leftist colors. But what this book is then is a frame for him to present basically all these different ideas, but it leads to it being really disjointed. So he does take us on a world tour. We go to Honduras, we go to Egypt, we go to Kurdistan, we go to Palestine, Egypt, Tunisia, a little bit in the United States. He seems to bask and glorify the Occupy movement, a movement that's already been forgotten, but with his leftist bona fides, he has to say, yes, it was this great breakthrough and it's really important movement. It's not really, it wasn't even important at the time. It seemed like it might have been important. So he's trying to put too many things under one roof. And I wanted to like this book because I liked so much of what he was talking about in his interviews, but I would still recommend the book because I would recommend it as a loose collection of articles that have some relationship to each other, that are superficially informing them on subjects which they can try to dig deeper into. And I think Matt was trying too hard to tie all this together. Yes, in some sense, they all have to do with the racket, but by trying too hard to cover too many things under one roof, he then doesn't deliver what I wanted, which was a tight, coherent narrative around one subject. And I think he could have done that by going deeper than by going as wide as he did here. And in fact, in one particular area, he's way off. And I've never heard anyone express it this way, especially someone who would, I would say, quote unquote, be on the right side on Palestine. In a controversial essay, 2 prominent academics, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, wrote that the pro-Israel lobby in Washington benefits Israel to the detriment of the U.S.'s own foreign policy objectives. The article caused great consternation among supporters of pro-Israel policies in the United States, but their argument was somewhat misplaced. The evidence would suggest that the relationship between the United States and Israel is much more symbiotic than Mearsheimer and Walt contend. Israel is by far the largest recipient of U.S. aid presently. Since 1947, Israel has cost the U.S. taxpayer nearly $84,855 million, which means that the taxpayer has paid $23,240 for every Israeli citizen alive. Now, I don't understand how that's symbiotic. So, Matt goes on to say, this is not the result of a mystical, paranoid Jewish lobby or a completely anomalous foray into the politics of altruism. Israel plays a very important strategic role for the United States, one which is based primarily on political expediencies. There is the cop on the beat strand, but there were also concerns about the march of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. So he calls it the mystical paranoid Jewish lobby. So he's trying to basically attack Professor Mearsheimer and Professor Walt with this semi-anti-Semitic smear, if you would say mystical paranoid Jewish lobby. But all of this information is outdated. The U.S. has penetrated, and he illustrates in the book, into Egypt, into Jordan, into all these other areas, Turkey. So the idea that they also need Israel is not true. They've penetrated all around the Middle East. They don't need Israel as their cop. They're patrolling all these other countries themselves. And if it was concern about the march of the Soviet Union's gone. So there is no symbiotic relationship. Matt only mentions it briefly. This isn't a book about Israel. He doesn't do a good job of dealing with Professor Mearsheimer's Professor Walt's book, which I am going to point out here. Matt, the Israel lobby is going to be talked about in 20 years. They're not going to be talking about the Racket in 20 years because that book, unlike this book, has a coherent argument around a topic. This is just a collection of articles about some general things. And so calling it mystical paranoid, there is a real Israel lobby. There is not a symbiotic relationship between the United States and Israel, except in some fever dream fantasy. So, if that's the only criticism I have of the book, I think it's quite light. I think it's one criticism among what I would say, again, generally a recommend, but not as a coherent argument, but more as a collection of articles on things that should be of importance to everybody, some of which are particular causes of the left, but that doesn't mean that because it's a cause of the left, it's not worthy of consideration. It's just that I would say this is a leftist primer, and it has Matt's particular point of view on things. And that's fine, because I think in many places he's quite just in the way that he presents things. So if you'd like to pick up a copy of the book yourself, you can do that using a link in the description below. That's one of the ways that you can support this channel. Hit like, subscribe, share. That's a free way that you can support this channel. If you'd like to thank me for this review in particular, there's Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal links in the description below. If you'd like to thank me on an ongoing basis, you can use Patreon or YouTube membership. That way you can get early releases of videos like this one, as well as talk to me behind the scenes and get ideas for different books, which I don't necessarily review, but are still on my docket and part of how I think about what I review in general. If you'd like to nominate a book for the future, just navigate to my Amazon wish list. That's also linked below. And you can sponsor a future book review by picking one of those books and sending it to me, and I will review it in due course. As always, until next time, enjoy your reading.